Hello, my name is Samira Salem, and I'm the Director of Community Development Services at Forward Community Investments, and co-author of the CDD Funding Process Study, along with Michelle Mackey, the Managing Director of Community Development at FCI. I'll be presenting FCI's report evaluating the CDD funding process. These are the many themes that you'll see throughout the report. I'd like to start by saying that it was a great privilege for FCI to have been entrusted by the City of Madison's CDD to conduct this funding process study. We understand the significance of this work and appreciate the bold leadership demonstrated by the City and CDD in taking an honest look at their funding process. Our recommendations call for hitting the reset button on community development efforts in Madison. You'll see that our recommendations are ambitious, realistic, and aimed at making Madison a leader in advancing racial equity, reducing poverty, promoting social justice, and maximizing community development outcomes. Change can be unnerving and even painful, but FCI is excited by the commitment CDD management and staff demonstrated during the study to a rigorous analysis of the funding process and opportunities for getting it right. We look forward to a Madison where all Madison residents and neighborhoods have access to resources and opportunities necessary to help them realize their full potential. This is the CDD vision. Before I get into the study recommendations, I'd like to take us back briefly to the beginning, the motivation for this study. In response to the Race to Equity and Joyner Sandbrook LLC reports, which highlighted the changing landscape of poverty and well-being in Madison and Dane County, the mayor and Common Council appropriated funds to analyze the existing CDD funding process and make recommendations for improving it. By June 2014, FCI was awarded a contract for the work. The goals of this work included providing technical assistance to identify policy goals and objectives for city investments in the social sector, to design the structure of a funding process that transparently allocates financial resources to community-based organizations that are best able to use them to achieve city's objectives. Next, to align division functions with new goals and objectives. And finally, to develop strategies to improve communication and coordination between the city and other major social sector funders. FCI's final report on the CDD funding process study can be found on the City of Madison's website under the Community Development tab. The report itself provides 3 sets of interrelated recommendations. The first is on the funding process reform. The second and third are on the proposed funding priorities and guiding principles. The guiding principles will serve as the overarching framework with which CDD should shape its funding process and funding priorities. CDD's mission and vision were established in the early phases of this study. I've already read the vision to you. The mission itself is that the CDD collaborates with residents, neighborhoods, and other community stakeholders to overcome barriers to opportunity in order to support a vibrant community, shared prosperity, and resident and community well-being. The words that are bolded here are bolded because you will see them again as we talk about community goals later on. These emerge as proposed community goals and priorities. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about our methodology. We used a 3-pronged approach to inform our recommendations around the funding process, proposed funding priorities, and the guiding principles. We began by doing a data analysis. We used both quantitative and qualitative data to get at the question of where CDD can have the greatest impact. We We then took the results of our data analysis to focus groups and interviews that we did. There were 61 people who participated in these, and they represented a wide range of stakeholders in our community, from grassroots and established nonprofits to community-based organizations, residents, subject matter experts, academics, CDD staff, alderpersons, and CDD policy committee members. We were able to cover all CDD program areas. And we asked those people that participated in both the focus groups and interviews, again, looking at our data analysis and the results from our data analysis, considering your experience and understanding of the funding process and also the context locally, how can CDD have the greatest impact? What are the 5 investments that CDD could make to do so? And finally, we also considered best practice research. Best practice research conducted by FCI and also work done by the Center on Wisconsin Strategy. If you look at appendices B and C, you'll find their excellent work there. And this is work that took a look at best practices in local government funding processes across the country. So we were able to draw from that as well. So in sum, our methods align well with those of other cities and counties that have evaluated their funding processes. Now, this graphic represents the 7 basic elements of the funding process as identified by the COWS report. What you'll see here is number 1, determining CDD's priorities. But number 2, the application process, or how the city administers its applications. Agency orientation refers to how the city orients agencies to the process. Resident engagement, or how the city incorporates residents or volunteers. Determining winners refers to how the city decides what gets funded. And that's followed by how the city measures outcomes. Its measurement really should help to inform the future of the next funding cycle. And finally, we have a catch-all category. Now, these do not go in any particular order. For example, citizen engagement, measuring outcomes, these happen throughout the process. And what we also know is that measuring outcomes in one period or one cycle will influence what happens in the next. So in our report, we identified nearly a dozen perceived and identified shortcomings of CDD's funding process. And our recommendations are really meant to address these. This table represents high-level recommendations or the headlines organized by the 7 elements we just discussed in the previous slide. Some of the shortcomings discussed in the report are, for example, the current application process is burdensome. On both agencies and CDD staff, the amount of required input greatly outweighs the resulting output in terms of funding amounts. So in the report, you'll see recommendations around streamlining where it makes sense and ensuring process transparency, part of the effort to get at this identified shortcoming. Another shortcoming of the CDD funding process that was identified is that despite the fact that there is a competitive process in place, the funding process doesn't always yield competitive outcomes. Part of the blame, we understand, might lie with the lack of consistency and transparency in the funding process between the RFP application, staff review, committee evaluation, and funding decision. And this lack of consistency and full transparency in the process may lead to suspicions about why some agencies get funding and others don't. And it opens up the process to a type of paralysis that results in a tendency to fund agencies that have previously received funding, thereby restricting access to funding by new agencies and dampening innovation. So here you'll see recommendations around application process transparency, decision-making process transparency, competency-based selection more robust monitoring and evaluation. And the third identified shortcoming is that there's a lack of meaningful community engagement in the funding process. Residents and agencies complain that while the city will conduct outreach efforts to community members to ask what they need, community input is seldom reflected in programming, and this results in frustration and lack of trust in the process. So there you'll see recommendations around citizen resident review teams that benefit from diverse input to evaluate applications, and more generally, there's an asset-based approach to community development that is recommended. So in the next slides, I'll get into more detail on some of our recommendations. We're not going to get into all of them. I really encourage you to read the report for a deeper dive on the rest. So FCI identified 8 priority recommendations which we feel are key to getting the funding process right. The first is to establish longer contract terms of about 3 to 4 years. What this does is it recognizes that community development takes time. Historically, CDD has operated on a 2-year time frame, with some exceptions. But the trend in cities around the country is that, cities around the country that fund community development is toward longer contracts in order to first give agencies more time to make an impact, and second, to reduce the burden of the funding process for agencies and city staff alike. And while contracts should be longer, we also recommend that there should be an annual review to make sure agencies are on track to receive continued funding. The next recommendation represents best practices and gets at agency orientation, that third element in the diagram. This recommendation promotes quality applications and access. And CDD already does some of this, so the orientations and agency presentations, but what we're talking about here is taking it to the next level and adding a couple of elements. On mandatory orientations, CDD currently does orientations, but making them mandatory and even more substantial will help level the playing field. Establishing an LOI prior to a formal application ensures that agencies don't waste their resources going after funding that isn't applicable to them. A feedback period between the initial application submission and final submission, during which CDD staff work with agencies to improve their applications, will allow CDD and agencies to have more complete and relevant applications. Finally, providing more time to present technical proposals to reviewing bodies before decisions are made is something we believe will be tremendously useful for the process. On this third point, using citizen review teams that benefit from diverse input to evaluate applications, we know that currently staff review the applications, make recommendations to the policy committees, who then make funding recommendations to the City Council. But what we're recommending is that instead there be a citizen review team, or more accurately, a resident review team, to evaluate the applications and make recommendations to the City Council. This is based off of a model that has an excellent 20-year track record in the city of Tallahassee, Florida. What we recommend here is that there be 8 to 10 member resident review teams structured in such a way to ensure that every community demographic served is also reflected in the decision-making process. Each team should include relevant expertise, 1 relevant policy committee person, 1 major community funder, 1 agency that's not competing in that particular round, 1 CDD staff, 3 or more individuals from affected communities, and the remaining could be individuals that have professional, or who are professional subject matter experts. One of the benefits of these citizen review teams is that it allows you to shift from a year-round appointed committee to short short-term committees. This reduced time commitment helps recruit a diversity in terms of the group of volunteers that will come forward to serve. Finally, we also acknowledge that in order to prepare individuals to participate effectively on these teams, there has to be mandatory and intensive training. The fourth recommendation refers to merging the CDBG and CSC committees into a single policy body focused on community development and community services, and eliminating the conference committee. This will streamline the application evaluation process and advance efforts to integrate community development and community services. Our fifth recommendation is to establish a more robust performance monitoring and evaluation system. We suggest the CDD consider outcome-based evaluation systems that answer the question, what has changed in the lives of those served as a result of this program? This new monitoring and evaluation system should also facilitate coordination with the city's outcome-based budgeting process when it's adopted. But whatever performance monitoring and evaluation system emerges, it should not add a significant reporting burden to funded agencies. As part of this recommendation, we recommend that CDD hire a monitoring and evaluation specialist and assemble a cross-division working group on monitoring and evaluation. Part of their efforts should be aimed at working with agencies to ensure that they are not only clear on what is being asked of them, but they also have the tools to do it. The sixth recommendation is to institute a competency-based selection process. This goes hand in hand with the establishment and rollout of a performance monitoring and evaluation system. It's not going to happen overnight, but criteria for selecting providers should establish competency, including qualifications and past performance, if available. Another related recommendation is to establish a formal appeals process for transparently addressing disputed awards. You may be starting to see that our recommendations will not only result in a change in the way CDD operates, but a cultural change as well. So key to its success is reorienting CDD staff roles so they change how they engage with agencies and the community. We're talking about a reorientation of CDD staff roles from project manager to partner, advocate, and evaluator. These new responsibilities should be reflected in new position descriptions and a new organizational structure that facilitates the integration of community services and community development. This will require capacity building of CDD staff. Our final recommendation is to hire a funding process reform manager. Given the size of the reform project and the level of effort it's going to take, CDD management and staff shouldn't be tasked with managing the reform. Instead, a funding process manager should be hired. This person should be responsible for implementing the funding process reform and guiding the reorganization of the division, including staff capacity building efforts. The funding process reform manager should work very closely with the CDD management team and staff, and should report to the City of Madison's Director of Planning, Community, and Economic Development. Now that we've reviewed the funding process reform recommendations, I'd like to move on to recommendations around the guiding principles. Again, the guiding principles serve as the overarching framework with which CDD should shape its funding process and funding priorities. The first of these is racial equity. We know that you can't do community development in Madison without addressing racial equity. The good news is that there are a number of efforts, including the RESJI, the Racial Equity and Social Justice Initiative, inside the city, which has developed robust tools that includes an equity lens for addressing racial equity in a thoughtful and impactful way. The next principle is integration, collaboration, and coordination. And the idea here is that there is a holistic and integrated approach to community development that rejects silos. One of the shortcomings that was identified in the current funding system is that it is siloed. So we're talking about coordinated service delivery, including case management, a multi-generational approach to community development. This also means, for example, that older adults are integrated throughout focus areas rather than having a single dedicated area. I'll talk more about this when I get to the funding priorities toward the end. But at another level, encouraging agency collaboration and CDD collaboration with other city and county departments working in complementary spaces is part of what this guiding principle is trying to get at. This guiding principle also speaks to the idea that we should be thinking about the ecosystem of CDD funding and funder coordination, that is critical to advancing community development goals in Madison. CDD cannot do it alone. Integrated people and place-based strategies. This refers to the idea that there is mounting evidence that suggests that a holistic and seamless approach to community development that integrates both people and place-based strategies represents a best practice in community development. By place-based strategies, we're referring to real estate and infrastructure-based activities in neighborhoods. It could include quality affordable housing, community facilities, and neighborhood-focused resources. The people-based strategies, on the other hand, include strategies focused on specific households and individuals that will have an impact on improving the quality of life in neighborhoods. For example, quality childcare, job training, placement, youth development, case management, crisis services, and services that address household stability, mobility, and homelessness. Meaningful community engagement. So good community engagement puts residents at the center of community development efforts and results in programs and initiatives that reflect community input. Here you'll see recommendations around resident leadership development and involving residents in the planning process, as well as what we've just seen, recommendations about establishing citizen or resident review teams to review applications. Accountability through transparency and metrics. This gets at transparency in the process and this idea of mutual accountability, holding agencies accountable for the quality of services they provide and CDD accountable for the investment it makes. This also represents an opportunity to align a more robust performance monitoring and evaluation system with the city's outcome-based budgeting once it's online. Now I'd like to move to proposed funding priorities. Again, these are based on the data analysis, feedback from focus group and interviews, best practices, as well as feedback and input from CDD management team and staff. Out of this emerged these three proposed community goals. Proposed community goal 1 being vibrant community, goal 2, shared prosperity, and goal 3, resident and community well-being. Next, I'll discuss the focus areas under each of these goals. But as I do, watch for the guiding principles. You'll see that they're woven throughout. Community goal 1, vibrant community through deepening social capital and neighborhood assets. The tagline here is strengthen a sense of community and build community assets to make neighborhoods more supportive, connected, resilient, and livable for all residents. Research points to the importance of having vibrant neighborhoods, and it makes sense. There is a tremendous impact, for example, on lifetime earnings and productivity of children growing up in resourced neighborhoods. The quote-unquote neighborhood effect is estimated to be roughly $900,000 higher for those who grow up in the richest 20% of neighborhoods as compared to those who grow up in the bottom 20%. Then you think about recent research, which suggests that poverty is inversely related to life expectancy. So the poorer you are, the lower your life expectancy. Bring this all together, and it really hits home the idea that neighborhoods matter. And overcoming the neighborhood effect requires policies aimed at building a vibrant community full of opportunity. This is what we propose under this community goal. So the first focus talks about community building through residents' leadership development and service volunteer opportunities. For example, volunteer opportunities for seniors in a multi-generational setting. Focus 2, or neighborhood planning, gets to promoting strong and sustainable neighborhoods by preparing and implementing neighborhood plans. The difference here is that they're neighborhood plans that engage residents in identifying issues, in setting goals, in designing strategies and plans to develop and maintain a built environment, and other resources or services that will contribute to a higher quality of life. Focus 3, neighborhood-focused resources. Here we're talking about the resources that will meet needs of neighborhood residents, neighborhood centers, small businesses that respond to needs in the neighborhood. Access to resources that will meet basic needs, improving residents' quality of life and strengthening neighborhood stability and community cohesion. And finally, Focus 4, access to quality, affordable housing options. This includes, for example, owner-occupied repair and rehab assistance, rental housing development and owner-occupied housing development, housing assistance that improves housing stability for home buyers, renters, and special needs populations, and related supporting services that reduce barriers to fair housing choice and provide individuals with the information or skills needed to get and maintain stable housing. Community Goal 2, shared prosperity through building human capital and economic development. The tagline here is children, youth, and adults are prepared for lifelong success. This goal recognizes that building human capital and supporting economic development efforts that are connected to good jobs and educational attainment represent necessary conditions for Madison residents to realize their full potential. Focus 1 on children and youth development supports a continuum of services from early childhood development on to youth development that includes middle and high school youth during out-of-school time. The kinds of activities that one might see under this would include innovative activities that provide guidance and help to establish solid social networks and life management skills, youth leadership development and community participation, as well as opportunities for youth who commit violations to participate in restorative justice activities. Focus 2 is on workforce development. Here we're looking again at a continuum of services, sort of this integrated stream of services that support high school graduation and GED attainment, career guidance, employment training services, and work placement in good jobs for youth and adults facing barriers to employment. And finally, Focus 3 on small business development. This economic development strategy complements workforce development efforts, providing alternative sources of local employment by providing support to underrepresented residents that want to start or expand small businesses. Now, Community Goal 3. Resident and community well-being through individual, family, and household stabilization and equitable access to resources. The tagline for this community goal is to connect vulnerable and marginalized residents with resources designed to avoid homelessness or other crisis situations, promote household stability, and maintain personal independence. Focus 1 is on individual, family, and household stabilization. Some of the proposed strategies here include maintaining the independence of senior adults in their homes of choice, providing safety, shelter, and support services to those impacted by family violence, sexual assault, and other crisis situations, providing homelessness prevention services, housing assistance for persons and families who are homeless, providing supportive services tailored to the unique needs of homeless individuals and families to help them stabilize their immediate situation, and supporting innovative programming aimed at helping homeless individuals and families remain housed, once housed, or advance on a pathway out of homelessness. And finally, Focus 2, which is equitable access to resources. And this gets at information, referrals, case management that are aimed at providing equitable access to resources for individuals and families. If you look at the report, you'll see that there's much more to it. And I've had an opportunity to provide some of the illustrative activities that might fall in these community goal areas. Finally, we've been asked a few times about why there isn't a specific focus area on older adults. This is a good example of an integrated approach that does not silo and therefore considers more holistic programming. What we see is that best practices, focus groups, and research point to an integrated, holistic, and multi-generational approach to working with older adults. Older adults are therefore considered throughout CDD funding within relevant focus areas rather than in a single, more limited focus area. And listed here are a number of areas in which there are likely to be direct programming for older adults. Now, there's no need to read this very wordy and packed slide, but we just want you to note that this theory of change slide represents a summary statement of the guiding principles, the funding priorities, and aspects of the funding process reform. So it brings together the building blocks required to bring about this long-term goal, the vision and mission that are established here. And it also includes, importantly, this idea of a continuous improvement loop. Finally, as you saw with the priority goals and focus areas, there are a lot of ways to go. This report represents a first step. CDD will have to work with partners and the community to craft their own detailed strategies for how to address the proposed priorities and how to implement the funding process reform recommendations. The next phase of the work is very important and shouldn't be taken lightly. It's going to take time and resources and working together. One thing we can't underscore enough is that CDD cannot do this alone. Thank you.